Hey everybody, I'm James P. Wagner here. I'm here with Nick Hale. We're the publishers for Local Gems Press. Hey Nick.
Hey James, hey everybody.
And this is the Publisher's Speakeasy, a little thing that we do where we kind of go a little bit from the publisher's point of view about publishing and poetry topics, but don't tell anybody. Started doing this because we get a lot of the same questions over and over. We've answered them a lot of live events, whatever, and we were like, well, let's do them online so that we don't have to answer them again. But we know we will anyway, but that's okay. But yeah, so today we have a question that, oh boy, could talk about this for a very long period of time. And some of you out there have probably heard me either rant on this concept, at live book launches or, even in some of the seminars we talk about it. And I know that everybody in my workshop group here at the bookstore has heard me talk about this and various other workshops I've led over the years. But the question here is basically, would you have any advice for somebody overcoming writer's block from the publisher's point of view? And yeah, I mean, I have thoughts just even about the phrase writer's block to an extent, because I think that there's almost like a certain cultural importance placed on that term, as if by the act of not writing, it's somehow important by just, calling it that. There's like a level of almost like, oh, my writer's block, that comes along with that I feel is a little bit silly. But I think that, just talking about the people who are struggling with writing and things like that, because there's obviously different levels of what we call writer's block. And I know that, writer's block is probably not even the right word for what most of the people go through. But, there's I think we all know that creative person, and it could be across any creative field, but let's just say, if you're a writer in a writer's group or something, I think we all know that one writer who's been working on that one novel for 35 years and hasn't ever come out with it and probably never will, whether that's because they haven't finished writing it or they're revising it and this and that. And we all know that. We all know that, in a lot of cases, that person's probably more in love with the idea of being perceived as a writer than actually doing the writing, because the number one way to get over writer's block is to just write more. And, I know that when people are doing it, there's a level of overwhelm about the pressure to kind of, write something that will be good or something that will be productive or whatever, but that's not really always the case. Sometimes you keep the pen moving, because you're kind of exercising the writing muscles, and maybe you'll go days or weeks without even actually getting anything that you feel is good. But, in the act of doing so, you're generating experience and you're generating ideas. And, those are things that you could then possibly at a later date take into something else. And sometimes just by doing it, you will actually get good things out of it. But, I think a lot about the people who write, nonfiction topics, like sports writers, or news reporters, or people who are reporting on things. You never hear too much about them getting writer's block, and that's because they always have something to write about. So that's part of it. So, and in some cases, writer's block might just be you currently don't have anything that you feel is worth writing about, and that's not really a writer's block. That's more like an inspirational block or a creativity block, or maybe just, nothing's occurring to you at the moment, so you're not wasting your time actually doing it. But there's still definitely something, worthwhile about actually, writing every day, even if you're not getting anything necessarily good out of it. I know that there's a whole philosophy out there about people who they write a poem a day or whatever. And, that might work for some people. Never really worked for me. I do try to, write, pretty often. I don't do it every day, but I've gone through periods where I've done it every day. But I would never get a complete good poem every day. In fact, I think that, that's probably almost impossible for a lot of people, if we're being honest, because, a lot of those people I've seen, they, some of them do it better than others, but some of the stuff comes out, obviously, when inspiration hits, it comes out way better than when you're just doing it to go through the motions. But the going through the motions is also important because, you're kind of paying a dues of getting the experience, which will really help when the inspiration actually hits. So the first advice I would just give about writer's block is, just sit down and write something. Write for the trash bin is something that, I forget who said it, but Stephen King may have even said that. But it's something about the idea if you just go through the motion of doing it and start producing something, more things will come. It's kind of like, getting to the gym. Everybody's like, oh, I gotta go to the gym. That's so much work. But once you're in the gym, it's like you never want to stop being in the gym once you're there. It's getting over the hurdle of actually doing that. Writing is, in some ways very similar, because the hardest part is sitting yourself down and actually doing it. And now I'll let Nick talk because I've just been talking for several minutes.
And I have some things to say too. So it's more like going to the gym than you might realize, because it's not just about that, but a lot of people love to talk about going to the gym because it makes them look good, and it makes them look so good that they don't need to actually go to the gym. And a lot of people do that with writing and writer's block as well. And I'm not saying this is everybody, but a lot of people talk about having writer's block just to make themselves look like a writer, as you sort of mentioned, you skirted around the idea. You know, people are so in love with the idea of being a writer. So that's part of it. But I think there are a lot of different reasons that people are struggling to write. And so if you're dealing with writer's block, my first piece of advice would be try to figure out why. What is the actual thing that's stopping you from writing? Because it's probably not what most people would think of as writer's block. It's probably either is it a lack of inspiration? Do you just not have anything to write? And if that's the case, then do you really need to write? And my philosophy on this, James, is probably very different from yours, because you're like, oh yeah, you just write for the trash bin because you're getting the experience. And I was like, well, if you don't have anything to say, just don't say anything. And maybe that's counterintuitive, you know, if you're a writer and you're trying to learn more about writing. And so maybe don't follow my advice, but that's what works for me. But that's also why I write so little. So, you know, take that with a grain of salt, but that's just my perspective on a lack of inspiration. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's you don't know what to say. And this does happen to nonfiction writers too, by the way, James. I'm reminded of that episode of Doug, where he's trying to start his little essay on silt about 50,000 times and then gets distracted by video games. Which brings me to the next point. Maybe there's just something a lot more salient that's grabbing your attention, and you either need to get that out of your system or get better time management and put yourself in an environment where you don't have the temptation to be distracted, because the brain likes to be distracted. So if you're sitting at your desk and you're at your computer to write, and you've got a browser there, and you've got all kinds of stuff on your desk, and you got a TV on behind you, you are going to be so distracted because your brain is going to want to do everything. So one productivity piece of advice that would also help for writers, there's actually a program that you can use that will lock up your browser for a certain amount of time. It's sort of like self-enforced parental controls. And so if you really feel like you need to focus and you're not going to be able to because that distraction is just too good, that's something else you can do. You can try the Pomodoro technique, where you set your alarm for, usually I've seen it recommended 20 minutes working, 10-minute break, but you find the ratio that works for you, and you sit and you write until that timer goes off. That might be a good way to help. Those things don't tend to work for me, which is why I say if you don't have anything to write, don't write. But I'll also be in a situation where I'm in the middle of doing 53 different things at the same time, and all of a sudden lightning strikes and I have to write it down. So I have much more the opposite, where I get distracted from everything else by writing. But first step is analyze why.
I think that just to kind of, quantify and clarify the idea of writing for the trash bin versus whatever is, because in some ways I definitely agree with the philosophy that, if you don't have anything important to write about, or you don't have any inspiration, sometimes just, not wasting your energy on that is a good thing. But at the same time, I would say, when I'm talking about writing, I'm talking about, there's writing for the trash bin. That's more like the mechanics of writing, because there's still a lot that you can work on, even if you don't have an inspirational topic. Like, for example, with poetry, especially, like form, meter, alliteration, a lot of poetry, tools that we actually use. Those are things you could all work on when you don't have any freaking good idea about what to actually do, but you can still work on them as an exercise, so that when that inspiration actually hits, it'll come out all the better because you've actually kind of flexed those muscles and do those tools in that regard. So I would say when I'm talking about getting the pen moving, I'm kind of saying sometimes write without expectation that anything good is going to come out of it, or you're really going to get a complete poem, which is why I don't subscribe to the poem a day philosophy myself personally. But then again, in my case, I know that you know this, because so many, when you kind of become an administrator of something, it's like the doctor at a hospital gets promoted to the administrator. They stop actually doctoring a lot because they're focused on administrating, so, in recent years, the quantity that we've actually written ourselves, has maybe suffered because of how much we're working with other people's writing and stuff like that. So in my case, I actually, part of the reason I even started another workshop group just, at the bookstore here is because, and a lot of it, like, yeah, we do like a critique, but a good portion of every workshop is actually write-in. So, we actually will sit there and write stuff while we're there, kind of like almost like a group writing study hall. And I kind of scheduled that on purpose because I needed that time to actually write down a lot of ideas that I had. Because, I have notebooks and I'll jot down like little ideas, or sometimes, just like one line of verse will come to me and I'll really love that one line and I'll write that down. I'll have no idea what comes before or after it, but I'll just write it down. And this is sort of like, clues or like little bits of, or little ingredients in like a poem recipe that'll come out later on when I actually have the time to do that. And so I've, actually done that. So, and that would be one way to get over, a hurdle of that, is to get around other writers, get around other poets, join a workshop group, join, like, even if you don't have one locally to you physically, there's plenty online that one can join. There's also groups where it's like you can share your work with each other, or you can share works in progress with each other. That certainly helps, because sometimes just seeing other people's writing process is inspiration for yourself, but also if you have an idea and no idea where to go with it, getting the feedback can really help with that. At Local Gems, we actually offer frequent poetry challenges where for a period of, 7 days, 10 days or whatever, you get like a prompt video every day that will actually, multiple parts or whatever, and then you actually write to those prompts. And, we've produced hundreds of chapbooks based on those challenges, because there's a lot of people who are like, oh, I really, want to write, or I have this, these things that I'm, swirling up in the head, but I haven't had like the time to actually organize them. So just having like the email coming every day, it's just been really valuable to them to actually do that. So, there's external mechanisms that you could actually do to kind of keep yourself on task, and getting around other people is a great way to do that.
Yeah. And to that point, read. There's a great cure for lack of inspiration. It's called stealing inspiration from other people. And now I don't mean to plagiarize, but sometimes lightning will strike in the strangest of places. And I know I keep using that metaphor, but a while ago, I was listening to a podcast on Tom Waits. It's actually the show where they actually break down. They go, each episode is one of his songs, and they just discuss a couple of musician comedians. It's very interesting. One of them used the phrase that I really love, cultural magpie. They were talking about Waits because he kind of steals from all these cultural ideas. And sometimes that's all it takes, is just finding one thing, one sort of cultural idea that will spark an idea in you. And you think, how can I use this and turn this into a poem? How can I take this line is amazing, but how can I adapt it to my own work? How can I use that as an inspiration for something that I wrote? And so a lot of the times, yeah, it's just getting out of your box, reading, doing things that you wouldn't normally do, experiencing something new that's going to push you to, find that inspiration.
Yeah. I mean, I think inspiration is a very big part of actually motivating yourself to do it. Because,
right.
At the workshop group that, had, somebody was just telling me about how, they're really good at writing when they're in what they call, the hot zone, where they're like, kind of worked up about something, or they're like, really emotional about something. And then that usually, gets them to actually write. She's like, but I can't write at all in the cold zone, when like I'm not in that state. And I'm like, I think that's probably the thing that really just motivates most poets for the first time you're writing to actually try to write a poem, is you're in some kind of a hot zone where there's something that's going on, or something's got you really fired up or emotional. And usually it's a negative at the first time. Let's just be honest with poets. Usually it's like something happened there that just gets you to like, get the thing and just start furiously writing about that. Yeah, I think we all know that.
For most of us, yeah.
Yeah, the hope is that eventually you kind of get over the angst and you start writing about other things. But usually it's something like that that's the first kind of impetus to actually write. And so, some people actually, argue that, you can't really replicate that moment. Other people argue you should be able to replicate those things. There was actually a professor, who was above me at the English department, at Dowling, who used to basically say, that part of being a good poet was to kind of learn how to kind of activate that mode, at will. And, I understood what he was saying. I don't know if I entirely agree with that, but, because then, another professor made the point that like, okay, you have somebody who, let's just say that they had a big fight with their girlfriend and they broke up. So this person goes home and starts, furiously writing a poem about the breakup, but then she calls them halfway through their writing, they make up, like, I love you, all that stuff or whatever. So now he's not in that mode anymore. He goes back and tries to finish the poem, and he can't do it because he's not in that same mindset anymore. And then, so there's little philosophies about that when it comes to things like that, and just being in that mindset. And then some people say, write when you're in the hot zone and then edit it when you're in the cold zone, which, could be a good thing too.
Yeah, and so I'm weird like that. So I don't know that if we're talking about hot zone as in like the zone of inspiration, usually that's not like that emotional charged area. It's usually more of an intellectual thing for me. So if there's something gets me intellectually excited, I'm much more likely to be able to write about it. But if I'm in a very emotional state, I'm not writing. I'm waiting until I cool off and capturing what that was, and writing about it after the fact from the head. And so, I mean, maybe that just makes me really weird compared to everybody else. But yeah, for me, that just works better. So don't take my advice if you don't write like me.
No, I mean, as I've gotten older, that's kind of been more the case for me also, is that, it's usually observations and things like that actually trigger the writing now. I know when I was younger, it was definitely more of that whole, like, that type of deal. But yeah, I mean, the main thing though is, writer's block is a very overquoted term that isn't always even the accurate way of putting what it is you're going through. Again, if, maybe something's just not inspiring you right now, in which case, there's ways to kind of seek out inspiration. Maybe you just don't have the time to actually sit down and do the writing, in which case, scheduling something or joining a group where you're going to have to be there at this time or whatever, kind of having the external, mechanisms kind of keeping you to task, could be really helping with that. Because like let's just be honest here. If you're not writing, you're not a writer. I mean, and this was something I used to get into arguments about with like colleagues, because they would say that writing is rewriting. And I would always say, no, writing is writing, which sounds stupid. But, and I get what they were saying about, a large part of writing is, revision. And, you might start out with an idea and have a completely different one. It might be something completely different. I've had that where I've been writing poems that I thought like, oh, it was going to be this way. And it's like, no, actually it's going more organically this way, so that happens. But, you sort of have people there who, they will write, like one page and, thinking like, okay, the job of the writing is done. Now it's all rewriting, and they'll spend like 17 years trying to edit that one page. And it's like, thinking about this from like a cooking point of view, if you have a burnt steak, no matter how much, and I know that there's people out there who like burnt steak, but, never meet me because we, I don't like to eat hockey pucks, but no matter how many spices you put on that steak, it's still going to be a bad steak. So when it comes with writing, the idea that you could take something that's kind of fundamentally and just, keep tweaking it and that'll make it good. I think that there's a lot of flaws in that argument, especially if you haven't really written over and over to kind of get the experience to produce, better writing. Because, a lot of editing actually happens, as you get experience, it happens in the head, where it's like you'll have a raw idea and before it even actually comes out on the page, you'll have already self-edited before it even comes out, because that's the experience that it produces that. But, more than that, it's like, you need to, like Ray Bradbury said it best. He said, because people talk about the quality over quantity, and, he was a very, very prolific writer. He wrote like, thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of stuff, and that was even just stuff that was published, not even counting like all the stuff that he chucked away. But, when people go with the whole quality over quantity argument, he would say, yeah, obviously quality over quantity, but quantity produces experience, and experience is necessary to get quality. And so people act like these are separate things. I don't think they are. And so, the bottom line is the best way to just get past a writer's block is to just force yourself to do some writing. It might be really hard at first. You might not get anything that's worthwhile for a while, but, as you keep doing it, the habit, will form and the experience will come, and, you might activate something that was kind of dormant, and then maybe you'll start doing it because, oh, inspiration magically will hit, and then you will do that too.
Yeah. And I would add to that, if you're not going to write, step outside your comfort zone, experience things that you wouldn't normally, because that forces you to see things in a different perspective, and that's where the writing comes from a lot of times. I will counter your no rewriting argument, and I know you're not saying no rewriting ever, but the practice of editing is sort of like the practice of writing from the trash bin, and that it's an exercise as much as it is something that you do to produce a good poem. So when I first started attending workshops, it was when I was in college, and we had those classes that were basically workshop style where we would critique each other's work. I didn't know what to say, and very quickly got better at figuring out what is the phrase I like to use in my workshop all the time, is that if I was writing this poem, this is what I would do. And I got very good at figuring out what I would do if I was writing it. And that helped me in my own writing, because I found that the more I did that, the more I helped people revise their work, and the more I revised mostly other people's works, because I would write stuff and then plan to revise it and never sit down and do it. But that's because I'm a procrastinator. You know, so but the more I did that with other people's work, the better I got at getting it right the first time with my own stuff. And the more I felt like, oh yeah, this is exactly how I want it. I'm not going to need to edit it at all. So yeah, there is a thing about just continuously writing, and that's great, because there are certain skills that you can only get by doing that. But there are also certain skills that you can only get by going back and critiquing and editing somebody's writing, whether it's your own or somebody else's, it doesn't matter. But if there are some things that you won't pick up just writing for the trash bin, so you're going to be continuously writing, or at least it's going to be a much slower improvement than if you do both simultaneously.
No, I mean, I agree. And yeah, like that's, obviously I'm not saying don't revise and don't edit, because obviously, I mean, and that's a whole art and whole process in itself. That's almost a different side of the brain, because obviously, and I mean, it's incredibly important, because obviously when you're writing, sometimes you are in that emotional state and you really need like other sets of eyes or a cooler head to really kind of see it from a different point of view. The thing that I'm saying though, when people say writing is rewriting, is they spend 10% of the time actually doing the writing and 90% of the time doing the editing. And maybe that actually is the ratio you will do, like with a specific project. But, just writing, spending so little time actually doing the writing is the thing that, like, you're skipping a very huge, important step of being a writer when, you're spending all your time just editing something very small versus producing more stuff to edit. Because, like, if you don't have the meat, you don't really, well, I was going to say you don't have the meal, but there's a lot of people out there who would argue with me. So, but you get the point that I'm making. You're like, yeah,
right. Yeah, I get it. But also, like that first poem that you talked about, I'll write 10 lines and then spend 10 years revising it. That's not always a burnt steak. Sometimes it's a hunk of marble, and sometimes it's a matter of carving out, the good from the bad, or carving away the burntness of the steak. I don't know. But it's not always a lost cause, but sometimes it's a lost cause. And part of that art is recognizing when it's a lost cause and when it's not. And I think both of those things will help you get better at that, because you're writing for the trash bin. A lot of times you'll be able to see, okay, there's something redeeming here. But also then experience editing and revising is going to give you that eye to be able to actually see it more clearly. So that you don't just see there's something good here. You see there's something good here, and this is how I carve it out.
Oh yeah, but you will have nothing to revise if you don't write in the first place.
That's true. So you need both. Yeah. That's the point I was trying to make. And everybody is a different proportion. Like, I write very little. I also revise very little. I'm a terrible writer. I'm not really a writer, maybe. I don't know. I'll let you decide, the audience, because I don't care. But it's everybody has their own patterns and what works best for them. When I schedule writing time, it doesn't work out very well. When I write with friends, I write stuff and they're like, wow, that was really good. And I say, well, I didn't think it was, but now that you say it, I like it. But I tend to, I guess, write better stuff, around people when I'm writing with other groups versus like if I'm just going to sit down and force myself to write. But if I force myself to write and I'm doing it with 5 other people who are forcing themselves to write, usually some good stuff will come out. So it's a matter of learning for yourself. Okay, why am I struggling to write, and what about me? Like, what can I do to sort of almost manipulate myself into writing good stuff?
Yeah, and that's really kind of a personal question too that I think a lot of people need to ask too when they talk about writer's block, because we tend to, just humans in general, like, and I think, the gym argument is kind of another point about this. We tend to make time and effort for the things that are important to us. So if like time and time again, somebody's like, oh, I have writer's block and they're never writing and they're not writing, maybe it's not that important to them, because if it is important to you, it's like you schedule the time, you make it happen at some point. And now obviously, things happen in life, maybe you don't do it as much as you want to or this or whatever, but like if you're talking like over a 10-year period, you've had writer's block for 10 years and you haven't written anything, that it's probably not that high on your priority level to do that.
Yeah. But it
sounds
like I was being facetious when I was saying, oh, well, if you don't have anything to say, just don't say it, and I really wasn't. Like maybe at that moment writing is just not for you, and that's okay. And maybe it's just for that time. Maybe you have a dry year and you don't write anything. I mean, to be honest, the past 4 years I haven't written all that much, and I mean part of it has to do with personal events and then COVID, but it comes and goes, and it's okay. But it's also good to recognize, like, okay, is it because it's just not for me right now and I need to put it aside and come back, or is it something I can power through and if I sit down and force myself, I'm going to jumpstart it?
Yeah.
And that's up to you.
Yeah, because everybody's different, and obviously every like inspiration that hits and the motivation and all that stuff is going to vary from person to person. Like I know somebody who they never wrote poetry before whatsoever, but when they saw like the poetic memoir challenge was going on, like one of our things or whatever, they sat down and they wrote this whole story, like basically a whole book of poetry just about memories with their mother, because they saw that, they were thinking about that. I think their mother recently passed or whatever, and it was like this was an impetus to actually just do that. And like, I mean, when I say they haven't ever written, I mean like they haven't really since school, so they did at some point, but they hadn't for like probably 20-30 years. But because this was an important topic to them and they had a lot to say, they wrote it out, they revised it, and then it came out very well, because this was like something important that actually came out, and it was genuine. So sometimes it's just again, it's a matter of having the thing to say and the inspiration. But yeah, I mean, just in general, I would also say another quick aside, would be prompts. I know.
How did we get through this whole discussion without mentioning prompts?
Yeah, I don't know, probably because there's the Puritans out there who are like, I don't need prompts, life is a prompt.
Life is a prompt, get out there and live. Yeah.
Yes, but the life is still the prompt. So it's like, because that's one thing I never understand the mentality. Like I get that like writing from an exercise or a thing like that isn't everybody's cup of tea. It's not, sometimes I like it, other times I don't like it, so it's not always my thing either. Like actually when I was even in poetry classes in school, half the time I would just write my own stuff rather than going with what the assignment was. Luckily I had professors who were allowed to do that. But the thing is like, if you're out in nature and you see a tree that looks like a witch, when you're inspired to write a poem from that, it's like that tree was the prompt.
Yeah.
It's like everything, all inspiration is kind of prompted by something, so whether it comes from like a book of prompts, something in nature, a personal experience, it's like it's all coming from somewhere else. We're not like manifesting reality in our brains.
Right. You don't live in a vacuum, and you don't write in a vacuum. But I mean, even if you're like, one of those people who has to be difficult, and you go to a workshop and you're like, this prompt is stupid, I'm going to do the opposite of what the prompt says. It's still a prompt. You're still following the prompt, but doing the opposite of what the prompt says, because the prompt is still pushing you to write.
It's kind of like when people talk about, like, what would you rather, like, what would you rather be physically fit, like have, train your body or train your mind? It's like, well, your mind is still in your body, so it's still kind of a part of it.
Right. So the answer is yes.
Yes, exactly. But yeah, so there's a lot of things out there actually for poetry prompts. Actually, at the end of this video, you can actually just click on a link in the description, and you can get 93 poetry prompts right from our website.
Well, that's convenient.
Yeah, so that could help with that. And those prompt journals have been downloaded like over 25,000 times at this point by people. So obviously, there's a lot of people out there looking for things to write about, and there's nothing wrong with that. So yeah, prompts, just another thing to kind of look at, and when we do our challenges, I always say you're free to use some of this prompt, all this prompt, or none of this prompt, entirely up to you. So you don't even necessarily need to follow the guidelines of a prompt. Maybe the prompt itself will just inspire another prompt that you will want to do, like you were saying. So
yeah, and if writing just one prompt is too easy for you, I have some friends who will take multiple prompts and combine them together. You can even take a whole bunch of prompts, write them on a piece of paper, put them in a hat, pull 3 out, and you have to combine all 3. That can get very difficult, but it depends on if you're looking for a challenge or if you're looking for inspiration. But prompts are definitely a great way to jumpstart that.
Yeah, and I mean, the prompt can even be something like, when I was in graduate school, one of the things that one of the professors was talking about is like, freedom and restriction, which was why they, really advocated writing in poetic forms. Because, like maybe you're a free verse poet, there's plenty of those out there, but learning to write in the form usually helps a lot with the free verse later on. It actually makes it better. So, sometimes the prompt could be as simple as like writing a sonnet. Like maybe you don't have like the dark lady that Shakespeare had or whatever to write about, or all of those things going on, but just the concept of writing within the form and doing the form correctly as a prompt, which can inspire some writing, because maybe you come up with a sonnet, maybe you even hate the sonnet, but then maybe it'll spark another idea that you will do like in another form or a free verse or something like that. So
yeah, or maybe it sucks as a sonnet, but if you take it outside of the form, you can sculpt it from a piece of marble into something nicer. And you never know when weird serendipitous things are going to happen, and let those be prompts too. I mean, there's this one time I was sitting in the diner with this guy, and we sort of overheard a very loud conversation a few tables over from us, and the conversation was hilarious.
Gee, I wonder which guy you're talking about.
I said that guy.
Oh, this guy.
Okay. And we were both at the same time said, I'm going to write a poem about that.
Yeah, but you won because you did it first. So.
But just strange things like that. I have people tell me all the time about things that they intend to write a poem about eventually. And I'm stealing some of them because it's been like 15 years and they haven't written this poem about the guy who put his wedding ring back on as he's getting off the train or whatever it is.
Yeah, I mean, my best-selling book to date, despite like all the, the attempts at being profound and all that stuff with different topics, my best-selling poetry book to date is The Customer's Often Wrong, which for those of you out there who don't know that, I worked at a convenience store here on Long Island. I was a drive-through convenience store, and this was before like the days of DoorDash and Uber Eats and things like that. So you can imagine like the customer base that would kind of come into this place. And I worked there for 6 years when I was, in college, and then some grad school. And every time something stupid happened with a customer, I just wrote it down in a notebook and I wrote poems about it. And, to date, I've lost track of how many copies of that I've sold, just because it's just stupid poems about working in retail, but it was like all the inspiration for that came from just, people asking me stupid questions and stuff like that, so yeah, it can really come from anywhere. But, if I had to just sum up, like, the most important thing I would say about getting over writer's block is just start writing. Again, like not every piece of writing has to be amazing, but you're never going to get to amazing writing if you don't write, so that's what, and we could have the philosophy back and forth about the editing ratio, the writing ratio, all that stuff or whatever, but like at least from my point of view, just how I would wrap it up, if you don't do the writing, you're never going to get to the point of being good at it. Like, again, you never throw a baseball, you're never going to be a good pitcher, like just kind of how that goes.
Yeah, I mean, it all starts with the writing. So I would agree, but I would also add on to that, try and figure out what really is holding you back, because then you can start to sort of diagnose that specific thing individually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this one went in a lot of different directions. You know, in fact, this is, we probably could have like an entire seminar series or class or something just about the getting over writer's block, because, you know, I feel like, you know, trying to wrap this up in a nice, neat bow so the video doesn't go too long, but I feel like we could talk about this for about another 18 hours and probably still barely scratch the surface about that.
Yeah,
But
I think we got over our speaker's block though. But no,
yeah.
I know this one, you can wrap this one up about as neatly as I wrap Christmas presents. So
Oh, so not wrap it up at all?
exactly.
Yeah. But then again, this is something that, you know, the idea of this has been so like, and it's not even just, you know, writing, it's all types of creativity, but this is something people have been talking about for like hundreds and thousands of years. So, you know, I guess even if this video went long, you can't really combine all that philosophy into a short bit, but yeah. So, okay, so basically the two main points here is start writing and try to figure out what's blocking you in the first place, I guess would be like the in conclusion of this video, I guess. So but yeah, like we were saying earlier, you know, look in the description below, 90 free poetry prompts there. So hopefully that'll help some of you get over your writer's block, if you're having some prompts. Thank you for listening, and you know, again, don't tell anybody about the speakeasy. And if you have other questions, please send them our way, because you know, we're having a lot of fun answering these and putting out, you know, weird videos about varying philosophies about writing and all that. So we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.
Bye, everybody.